I'll fix that. Sorry, I forgot to check that. Oh gosh. Right, hang on. Rename. Are you okay? Just Ana Sampson. Yeah,
Yes.
all right. Well, who am I? I'm Carolyn. Right, that's fine. Right. Okay. Well,
I'll fix that.
Oh,
I'll fix that. Sorry, I forgot to check that. Oh,
it's the YouTube stream. Okay. Well, welcome all. This is a fantastic event. I'm very pleased to be hosting. Anna, would I be able to introduce you?
Yes.
I should introduce myself. I'm Carol Ann Cook. Hi, I'm a poet and novelist, and I've got a poem in this book that we're going to discuss tonight. So that's really, really great. And to introduce Ana Sampson has edited 7 poetry anthologies. Is that correct? I don't want to be reading
It might be 8 now. I'm sort of nearly finished it at the 8th.
Okay. Almost 8 poetry anthologies, including Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, which is the 3rd best-selling poetry title of 2009. She is Fierce, which was a #1 Amazon category bestseller, and She Will Soar. Her books have sold over 240,000 copies, and she writes and speaks often about books and poetry in the media. She's also spoken about the hidden history of women's writing at bookshops, festivals, libraries, schools, and literary events. Anna is also deputy publicity director at Kirkus Books as part of a job share working on a great range of fiction and non-fiction. She lives with her husband, 2 young daughters, and 2 middle-aged cats. Fabulous. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure to chat to you tonight. Hopefully this time has given everybody who's attending an opportunity to do the childcare or the child putting to bed. I haven't. Mine are still wandering feral and hunting for food.
They can probably hear me through the ceiling, which is below their room. So I better not say anything too incriminating, had I?
Indeed. So tell us about the inspiration for this wonderful anthology.
Well, I'd edited quite a few anthologies, and since my eldest daughter was born, there have been a few poems that I've been squirreling away, just sort of thinking, when I edited She Is Fierce, which was a collection of poems by women, my editor had to take me to task a bit about the fact that there were a lot of poems about pregnancy and young children and motherhood, just because my kids were very small at that stage, and that was the stage of the life I was in. And so those were the poems that were really striking kind of personal chords. She said, this is supposed to be a collection for everybody, of all ages, and really this is becoming a bit myopic. Okay, so we had to cut loads of them out. So I had been sort of squirreling them away since then in the hope that at some point I'd get the opportunity to edit a collection of motherhood. But it really came about because Sam Eads, the editor, I think she just felt so sorry for me tweeting about my 4-year-old's behaviour during lockdown and how little I was enjoying homeschooling, combining that with my various jobs. She got in touch on Twitter and said, I feel like you should do an anthology of motherhood. And so it was just I was so pleased to be given the commission to do it. And then I said, could I write some sort of personal bits about my experiences in there as well, which of course I immediately regretted when I had to put it together in 3 months with no childcare. But in many ways it was this really lovely experience because I was doing it in the midst of parenting more intensely than I think any of us would have chosen to.
Yeah,
I think it's fair to say. My husband works on site, so it's just me at home with my 4 and 7-year-old during the day, sort of trying to school them and entertain them and also put this book together. And it was a question of, actually, can you go away, find something else to do somewhere else so I can read these beautiful poems about how much I love being a mother. And it did give me a sort of community where there wasn't a community, where I was cut off from my friends and all support networks, of course, as we all were, and family and my own mother. And I sort of felt in the pages and in the poems that I was reading that kind of sense of community and that sense of solidarity and that feeling that I wasn't alone. And also a reminder of the wonderfulness and the magic in the madness and
Yeah.
That when I was very, very pressed against the face of motherhood, it was a bit difficult to see.
Yeah. That's really interesting what you say about community, because one of the things I was going to ask was, I guess, why an anthology? Why not a, kind of not a memoir, but like a non-fiction book that you would write, or, to gather together work from other women is an interesting choice. And so I think you might have sort of answered that. Because you were reaching for that community, and that's such an important thing, I think, for any new mother, a community and a network.
Absolutely. And there's a few poems in here that really speak to that. I know Polly Clark's The Baby Group was one that I'd had earmarked, for about 5 years ago. If I ever got the chance to do this, that was going in, where she talks about those people who maybe you don't actually get very close to, or you sort of drift in and out, and you just see them in a drafty village hall once a week where someone's passing around. She says, Our Lady of the Asda fairy cake, haven't quite got anyone's names, even though you might know their children's names if they keep like bonking your child on the head with a rattle or something.
That is
those
thing, isn't it?
Sort of often transient bonds that you form that are so important at the time. And I think especially for people who have had babies over this past year, it must have been unimaginably lonely, and that feeling of being often lonely but never alone, which I remember quite well from maternity leave, where there's always constant sort of demands on you. You're never alone with your solitude and your thoughts, but you often feel very lonely. And I felt that again sort of during lockdown and homeschooling, and all of these different voices of women's experiences really felt buoying. It felt like they lifted me up and reminded me I wasn't the only person on my hands and knees. Delivering crumbs for what felt like 7 hours a day.
I wonder, I have to say, whenever I had my first child, which was just over 14 years ago, I really, as a writer and a reader, I really wanted some literature. And it seemed to me then that, well, certainly there wasn't what there is now. There wasn't the kind of literature that there is now. And I wondered, because something I find as well is that motherhood's quite controversial, and I don't know why, because it's an odd thing to be controversial. Did you find any controversy in kind of putting this together?
I haven't so far. There were things that I felt, for example, I said we oughtn't to have someone breastfeeding on the cover. There were some beautiful artworks with women breastfeeding, and I strongly felt that I didn't want anyone to feel, excluded by the fact that perhaps if that hadn't worked out for them for any reason, or they hadn't wanted to do that. So there were things that I was mindful of, and obviously, particularly when I wrote my little bits, I was at pains to say every mother's different and every baby's different. There are sort of things I think that are recognizable to everyone. But when I was writing about milestones, I was sort of saying, well, I felt like a really major milestone, weirdly, was one time being downstairs and my husband and I sort of hearing something happening upstairs and realizing it was my daughter getting up from her bed, taking herself to the loo, having a wee. Not washing her hands. I'd love to think she was washing her hands, but toddling off back to bed without calling us for help. And that felt like this enormous milestone, which of course other people have their own sort of way markers where they have a moment where they go, oh, I've read a whole Sunday newspaper, without being interrupted, and that there's no greetings card for that. It's not a recognized occasion. So everyone's experience will be so different, of course. And that was what was nice actually about having all of these different. What I found really interesting was how incredibly affected I could be by the poems that were about experiences that I hadn't had. So the empty nest poems were the ones that had me, really absolutely in tears with how emotional they made me. And of course, my kids are 4 and 7. My nest is very full. And while I was editing this, it was very full. No one was going anywhere. And, the idea of having a hulking teenage son who's sort of growing out of everything. And they still struck a chord. That was what was nice about it, really, that there was common ground and things that I felt I learned.
I think you're right. I think the sort of discourse of motherhood, or the literature of motherhood, is a testimony of lived experience. And so it's you're trying to find, I guess, I was thinking about when I was trying to find, I think the only book I found at the time, because I didn't have loads of time, as you don't. When you've got a newborn and you don't know what's hit you. The only book, I was in motherhood, I think, buying a maternity bra, and I found Jules Oliver's book, and I bought it, and I really hoped that she was going to say, "Oh, it's awful, I'm struggling." And it was, "Oh, it's so wonderful."
I drift through fields of corn with my grinning baby. That's not what you want to read at the time.
Yeah. So, but yeah, there is something about the intimacy, isn't there, in connecting with a poem. It feels like a documentation of this moment that is otherwise downplayed in other discourse. To the person experiencing it, it's momentous. But it's
so seismic.
Exactly. And I was really, I just remember now, I've got 4 kids now, which is crazy. But yeah, when I had my first, I just thought, who does this? Like, why did the Holly McNish? Nobody told me.
Nobody told me. Actually, I do remember saying to someone, the problem is people do tell you, you don't really understand or believe them.
That's true, yeah.
I do, as I went through, and what you say in your anthology, which is such a touchstone to me, and I was just saying before we came on how I've lost count of how many times I've read that introduction. Every time I have to sit down and write something about why literature about motherhood and poetry about motherhood has been, until really quite recently, so undervalued.
Yeah.
I come back to your introduction, in which you say so much about this, and on a much more basic level, it is that feeling of that in The Other Woman, the poem by Kate Clancy in here, where she's worrying about going to the pub and boring her friend who doesn't have a child about her baby, that I remember writing in my, when I read it again, when I was going back over those kind of crazy early days, I kept a diary, which was really helpful to look back on. There was lots of things I'd forgotten, like congratulating myself for meeting a friend and not talking just about them. It's not, you think everyone would be bored by this,
Yeah.
And this is mundane and unexplainable and just involves a lot of wiping, and how am I going to explain it anyway? But yes, to you it is catastrophic, not necessarily in a bad way, but just it is an earthquake in your life from which you never really
you
return.
I think you're right about all that. People probably do tell you, but you have no frame of reference. Even if you've babysat a lot, I don't know that. I think you would have to be a midwife, or so. I don't know how you would to be responsible for something.
And I'm not sure I'd held a baby more than twice before I had my daughter. It's very unprepared.
Me too.
Ignorant.
You do become an expert very quickly, though, I think, even though you don't feel like it. I think on hindsight, the sort of skill set that you acquire, such as tiptoeing out of a bedroom, not waking up a sleeping baby,
toddler negotiation skills.
Exactly. There should be an Olympics of these things.
Absolutely. And another thing I think that you talk about in this anthology, and that I came up against again and again, is that sort of idea of actually motherhood and creativity can coexist and feed each other.
Yes.
Partly because of the kind of emotional range and the sort of rawness and vulnerability of that feeling of your children. Your heart is out walking around the world completely innocent of the fact that something is going to trample on them at any moment that you're sort of waiting for. So that kind of vulnerability, but also just the sheer efficiency of a woman who might have 20 minutes of nap time and might have 2 hours of nap time to get everything that they wanted to do an entire day done. And that's sort of, a lot of your interviewees in Writing Motherhood say this, don't they? There's no faffing around, every second counts now. I think if you perhaps had always wanted to do something creative and you hadn't got round to it, it might be exactly the galvanizing force that you needed to go, there's no time, I'm not going to, because everything has got to be slotted into such discrete windows.
That's right. No, it's so you're so true. Because I just did an event. I was chairing Erin Kinsley and Felicia Yap, and Erin was saying that when she started writing, she would get up. Her son, I think she said, was little, so she would get up from 2 a.m. and write until 4. Which I take my hat off. I
couldn't do that.
But as she said, you got to do what you got to do, and
yes.
So I completely relate to that. You just cut your cloth accordingly and you get on with it, and you suddenly become super productive.
Yes. And I think a lot of the poets in the book had started writing, quite late in life, and really it was something that they'd tinkered with, and then they got serious. It sort of focused them in that way.
Yeah. And I think also it gives you a lot of material. That's not to say that, because I was a writer before I had children, and actually I remember very vividly when my daughter was born. I mean, she was only a few days old or whatever, but I was really worried because I had no brain. I just couldn't function at all. And I thought that was it. Writing never happened again because I cannot think. I couldn't compose a text message.
Yes.
But
I think I read 2 books in the first year of my daughter's life, having read 2 books a week for the entire since the age of whatever. And I also remember getting a job offer, 6 months in, with someone who said, I think you'd be great to come and work with us. And I just was like, are you insane? My brain is porridge. I'm never working again. I'm broken. This is, And she had children of her own, and she said, no, you'll be back. And she was right, but I couldn't see it at that moment.
Well, that's good to. It's nice when people tell you that from the sort of further on bit. So I think that's what I like reading about as well, as you say, about from women who are at different stages, because very often when we think about motherhood or talk about motherhood, there's this assumption it's about new motherhood. And while that is this kind of mega event in your life, the shift from being child free to suddenly having this little baby and healing from whatever kind of birth you had is massive. But further on down the line, I've got 2 teenagers now, and that's this whole other planet.
Yes, I can't even think about that yet.
No, don't.
Yeah, no.
But as you say, then thinking about empty nesters or that kind of stage of life, it's not confined to those early stages or those months or years. It's actually much longer.
Yes.
Wider. But just to think about what you were saying about creativity and how motherhood can actually stimulate creativity, I think that's really important. It's sort of brought out in your book as well. I mean, the Holly McNish poem, she's talking about reading to her daughter, and you sort of mention it as well. I can't quite find the section where you mention it. But yeah, I suppose that was one of the things I wanted to talk about in writing motherhood, that there is this kind of thought process that children, it's that pram in the hallway idea.
I had used that phrase so many times, and I didn't know until I read your book that was written by a man who was advising male writers that the pram in the hall, even though obviously they wouldn't be dealing with it, would be an issue for them. And just that sort of made me obviously furious, but it was fascinating to learn, because I'd always sort of assumed that was something that might have been said by a woman. I'd heard the phrase and not realized that it was.
And there's this also this sort of idea, this concept that or who said it, I can't remember now, but someone said that each child costs a female writer, X amount of books.
Yes.
There's this kind of there's this weird sort of lie that's thrown out there about motherhood dampening creativity, whereas actually it's not that. it can actually be galvanizing, as you said. It's about the publishing of women's writing,
yes,
which we're beginning to see a lot more of, I think. And I
think we are now. I mean, it's shocking how recently Holly McNeish was talking about the difficulty of publishing Nobody Told Me, which of course went on to become not only a bestseller, but such an iconic touchstone for so many women, you know, something that is passed between mothers, you know, as a, you're going to want this now. You know, it's such a sort of classic text, really, that was considered by lots of mainstream publishers so recently to be, you know, niche to the degree that it was unmarketable.
I know. I mean, because I remember her telling me that was 2014. And she told me that at Stanza that she just secured a publisher for it, but it had been turned down 3 times because it was too niche.
And she was already someone with a profile, with a, you know, publishing track record. She was not an unknown.
No.
So it is quite extraordinary, isn't it?
It's really extraordinary.
I was working with a novelist recently in my day job as a publicist, Ali Benjamin, who wrote a novel called The Smash Up, which is a brilliant novel, which very much female rage and motherhood are 2 kind of key themes. And she said, actually, she found it was a real creative spur to her in the sense that when you have children, you spend a lot of time imagining the world as it might otherwise be. You know, you want to think of a world that is different, a better world. You want to envisage a world in which your children will grow up. You sort of immediately have a second perspective as how will this affect me? How will this affect my child and their kind of environment and view on the world, which I hadn't really thought of it like that. I thought that was a really interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I can
really have an urge to imagine the world otherwise, which makes it useful if your job is imagining the world otherwise and writing about it.
Yeah, no, I can definitely relate, because I don't know, maybe it's I think it's maybe a bit of both, getting older but also being a parent. I'm just fed up with the world. I'm not taking any crap anymore. So I can definitely relate that you want to suddenly, and maybe because you're called upon so much as a mother, that you want to begin fixing more and more things, not just the sort of domestic spaces, but the world outside.
Yes. I mean, life is fine, but I have a daughter, so you need to turn the internet off now.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I can really relate to that. I'm noticing the time, so I'll say to our audience, we will be taking some questions. I'll say about 22 or 1:45. We'll turn over to you for some questions. But I wonder if we should look at some individual poems in the book and talk about those and why you chose them.
I'd love to. I've got a few here. Do you want me to read one? And then I'm going to ask you to read Hair, of course.
Oh, yes, I'd love to.
Let's have a look. This one is a lovely one, Poem for a Daughter. So I could read this one by Anne Stevenson, which there were bits of this that I sort of smiled at, and then the odd bit that just really made me do my poetry gasp, where I go, oh, this is just completely electrifying, and this is going in for definite. So this is called Poem for a Daughter. I think I'm going to have it, I said, joking between pains. The midwife rolled competent sleeves over corpulent milky arms. Dear, you never have it. We deliver it. A judgment the years prove true. Certainly, I've never had you, as you still have me, Caroline. Why does a mother need a daughter? Heart's needle, hostage to fortune, freedom's end. Yet nothing's more perfect than that bleating, razor-shaped cry that delivers a mother to her baby. The blood cord snaps that held their spear together. The child, tiny and alone, creates the mother. A woman's life is her own until it is taken away by a first particular cry. Then she is not alone, but part of the premises of everything there is, a time, a tribe, a war. When we belong to the world, we become what we are. again, there's so much in that, so much packed down. It's so sort of concentrated, so many ideas.
Yeah.
You know, you move from one life into another, but you also, I love the word tribe in that.
Yeah.
And war. You know, the drama and the sort of sisterhood that we spoke about earlier.
Yeah, I love that line that the child tiny and alone creates the mother. Gosh, it's so true. I love the poem as well, The Republic of Motherhood, that you have in here, which I just think is
there were about 3 poems that I knew right from the beginning were going in. There's 2 by Catherine Simmons called The New Mothers and When 6 O'Clock Comes and Another Day Has Passed, and The Republic of Motherhood, which was one that I felt like I'd been punched when I read it. It had an almost physical reaction on me.
Yeah.
My youngest was 1 when I read it for the first time. And I'd just never seen this written about like this, in this way. She absolutely, that idea of a totalitarian state where you hand over your clothing and you have to move your lips to the anthem even though you don't know the words, in which I think she's saying something really profound about motherhood, but also managed to remind me of all the rhyme times at the library where I didn't know where the ducks went swimming, and everyone seemed to know what weaning was, and I felt like I didn't know what I was doing. And
oh gosh, yes.
It's sort of heartrending and brilliant and so kind of accurate.
And that last poem, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but what I love about it is it feels like it's like a gift. You want to, it is a collection you want to share with people because there's such truths in here that they just ring. They have that amazing, sort of sense that they speak of experience in such an authentic way. And that poem by Ada Limon, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Yes. The Raincoat. Oh my gosh. I'd read that poem before because I have her collection, or one of her collections, but reading it all over again, it brings, I loved how you bring the poems into dialogue with each other.
Oh, it was such a lovely thing to do, though I did cry a lot. And I always cry when I edit poetry, and spend sort of hours reading poems.
Yeah.
And this was the collection that really, every single one that ended up in here, almost every one, I have sobbed over at some point. So it's lovely to see them finding their readers, and also after a year that I think has been really challenging for everyone and for parents in that sphere, new mothers and people, all of us missing our own mothers perhaps, and so it felt every time someone gets in touch with me to say that it's meant something to them, it feels like something I like a gift. It's been a lovely thing to do.
Yeah.
Will you read Hair, please?
I will indeed. Yes. Yes. I don't know if I should give any context to this. Because I remember when I wrote this, but my son in particular, he's 13 now, but he had croup, which I'd never heard of. One of the many things with parenthood that you've just never heard of until it's suddenly this massive part of your life. And you suddenly find
and your only topic of thought.
this thing. Yes. So anyway, I had to I was so scared. What croup is, it's basically it's a respiratory problem. He would bark like a seal when it was like that cold, damp air in sort of autumn, winter time. And I was so afraid of him just stopping breathing, which can happen. So he would lie on my chest for months. He just lay like this little seal cub. But anyway, let's position the book. Hair. I kept you in bed with me so many nights, certain I could hold the life into you, certain that the life in you wanted to leap out, hair-like, go bobbing off into some night field. For want of more eyes, more arms, I strapped you to me while I did the dishes, cooked, typed, your little legs frogging against the deflating dune of your first home. Nested you in a car seat while I showered, dressed, and when you breastfed for hours and hours, I learned how to maneuver the cup and book around you, time and friends and attitudes too. We moved breakables at height, no glass tables, fitted locks to the kitchen cupboards, door jammers, argued about screws and pills someone left within reach. I'll not tell you how my breath left me, how my heart stopped at your stillness in the cot, and who I became when at last you moved. There is no telling what skins of me have dropped and shed in the fears I've entered. What I will say is that the day beyond these blankets, beyond our door, is known to me now, fragile as moth scarf, its long ears twitching, alert, white tail winking across the night field.
It's such a pleasure to hear you read that.
Oh, thank you.
There's so much in there, and it's so vivid, the frogging of the legs, and there's just it's so evocative to me of that time.
Yes.
All of the images, all of the sort of desperate, the alertness that you are basically alert. You're constantly alert for at least a year.
Yes.
But longer than that, really.
Yeah, like hyper alert. It's that oh gosh, I can't remember her name, which is terrible. It'll come to me, but there's an author who speaks about the state of being constantly interrupted or interruptibility, and she's talking about that expectation of being interrupted.
Yes.
And it's Janet. I'll look up her name, but I was like, yes, that is it. Because I remember
a friend did say to me during homeschooling, she said, it's like the interruptions have interruptions within them, like an endless set of interrupting Russian dolls. Until I've been interrupted so many times,
yes.
I couldn't possibly hold, even the fact that I needed to update the Sainsbury's list, nothing, let alone to do something, anything more kind of committed or creative than that.
Yeah.
And you just capture that.
A Russian doll of interruptions. That is very true. Yes. And I always find, because I used to try and write when my children would sleep. So I would try and write then. And it would always be the case. I marveled at it that, they would sleep for 2 hours if I was out and about or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They sleep through a brass band. But the minute I'm like, right, today you should have a nap for 2 hours, so I'm going to write. And they would sleep for maybe 20 minutes.
Yeah, my daughter had a totally foolproof hour and a half. She'd have an hour and a half in the morning. I could never get her into any other thing than that, my eldest daughter, until I planned to do something during that hour and a half. And I'd say, we'll have a work call during that time, or, I'll do something. Don't worry, she's reliably washed to sleep then. She would know.
Yeah, it's like they know. It's the same kind of weird radar they have when you have a really late night.
Yes.
I'm going to stay up. I'm going to just
4:30.
Without fail, they would sleep in any other time, but the time that you decide to stay up, they're up with the larks. So yeah, that
hypervigilance. And there's another poem in here, If I Sleep While My Baby Sleeps.
I was just looking at that by Alice.
And she says my sleep floats within a, and we are sort of united in that. And I always found it very difficult because my daughter always woke up screaming. She was 0 to 60. Like, people would say, sometimes I go in the morning and he's just lying there cooing. I was like, what? They don't do that. My second used to do that, and I go in and go, oh, you're awake. That wasn't the case in my first. So I was always sort of being like on the end of a spear out of sleep. And it does make you a bit mad. I think but that hypervigilance, and also the image of the hair, the sort of wildness of that, and the streak of it in the night, and the fact that it's a nighttime animal, it's perfect.
Oh,
so pleased to have it in.
I remember I wrote that poem really, really quickly. It didn't take any drafts or anything, and I think it's just one of those things, isn't it? And that's why writing is so essential. I think it's not just something that we do. It's essential, I think, for new mothers to try, and it doesn't have to be a poem, but to try and articulate, find some kind of way of expressing their experience of motherhood. Because there's just so many new things, there's so many big feelings that I don't think have any comparison elsewhere. How do you put into words the experience of this, being sort of tormented with lack of sleep and all the sort of physical stuff that comes, but yet being fully prepared to just lie down in traffic for this this little
yes
bit,
I mean, I think actually something that's lovely about social media is there are communities that have sprung up, the Mum Poem Press and the Mothership Writers Groups, the two that I've become aware of recently, where they're also giving women that permission to write about this subject that for so long was seen as, you talk about Sharon Olds in the 70s getting a rejection letter from a literary magazine saying, well, if you want to write about your children, might we suggest the Ladies' Home Journal? And I think those attitudes really persist. So the poet Kim Moore, who's got a brilliant poem in here, said to me that actually when she was pregnant, a lot of particularly male writers had said to her, oh, you'll just write about babies now, will you? And she thought, A, no, and B, why is that not an okay thing to write about? Nothing much else is happening in your life when you have a small baby. Most of us aren't also, I don't know, war correspondents or leading scientists at the same time as you've got a 6-week-old. So
it is an interesting thing. I think motherhood becomes this weird sort of site in terms of, I'm thinking it in more of a sort of, I guess, political sense or in a media discourse, that it becomes this place where sexism seems to be more permissible. People, these sort of attitudes about mums and mothers and, oh, is that all you're gonna, it's boring to be a mother and you're gonna get baby brain, It's very interesting. I find it interesting precisely because you see how many social and cultural attitudes spring up or become visible when you really look at motherhood and how we talk about it and how we silence it. Because I think that idea about nobody told me, I genuinely did wonder, because I thought, why has my grandmother never told me this, and my mother hasn't really told me about her experiences of motherhood? Why does this all feel so new?
Yes.
So I do think there has been a generational silencing of this experience, and it's interesting to consider.
There is so much that you only sort of discover once you're in it, and you do think, why did no one tell me that my hair was going to fall out in chunks and that my gums would go wrong? My gums would need extra attention.
Right. My hair fell,
even the physical, without starting to address any of the implications for career and work. And so I've since I took maternity leaves, though I edited anthologies during them, and then I went back to work, and I've found there are pressures there with some people, I think, don't want to ever kind of mention the parenting aspect of their lives because they fear that it will hold them back.
Right, yeah.
Whereas I'm probably too open about, and particularly over this last year when it has been, a genuine juggling act where I was doing both at the same time. But I sort of feel like I had kind of thought that all the feminist battles were won until I had children.
Yes.
And that I'm not helping anyone, any younger colleagues, male or female, who might want to have a family by pretending that it's entirely easy to work and not pointing out the juggle. And because my husband is working on site and because he works quite long hours, and so the pick up and the drop offs, do fall to me. I think it's quite important to say, I have to leave the office now. My kids are going to get put out with the bins. You know, there is a logistical, you know, we have no parental help nearby. Obviously, we have childcare, but that doesn't offer as much flexibility and is incredibly expensive. So I don't know. But then I worry, am I being the person who always finds out about their kids? Which I am. But I do feel that unless these things are talked about, people won't make these decisions in any kind of an informed way, as indeed I didn't.
I think that, and there's a lot. It's because when we talk about motherhood, well, I mean, one of the questions that I got asked when I set up the Writing Motherhood project was, well, why is it not writing parenthood? Why are we not talking about fathers? But you know, there's a lot that is very specific to women.
I think that is hopefully starting to change a little bit more with parental leave, which wasn't something that was open to us at all, the idea of shared parental leave. But again, that's not offered in a lot of places, and it's not taken up that much, and hopefully that will start to change the dialogue. But I would say yes, definitely there have been so many things that are
I mean
specific.
well, because it's not even, my daughter's only 14, but at the time my husband only got 1 week off, 1 week, because I remember vividly being sort of petrified, thinking, you're leaving me
the first day when they go back. My sister came and sat with me that day, and then she had to go. I was like, oh, what will I do?
I was so
and my husband has said, oh, I'm not going to decorate the nursery, which, I mean, nursery is a grandiose term for what was in fact the cupboard under the stairs, now 1 bedroom flat in the basement, basically. It's brilliant. It was an ambient 17 degrees all year round, no need for blackout blinds. It was perfect. Did it for 1.5 years. But he said, well, maternity leave, so I've got 2 weeks, that's basically holiday, so I'll just decorate the nursery then. Of course, 8 months later, have we wanted to paint?
Yes, no, it is astonishing, I think, how things have changed very
recently,
and even between having, I mean, there's only 5.5 years between my first and my fourth child, which is again stupid, but the sort of advice that I was given differed within that time period.
3 years between mine, total flip. Between the alcohol and the eggs, there was all sorts of things that changed in that time. And of course, when that happened, I could see why my mother couldn't understand why I wouldn't give my baby water when she was enormous, thirsty, born in the middle of a heat wave. But of course, it was drummed into them that you would not give them water, whereas her generation, she was like, why are you parching this child?
No, it was interesting because my husband's my grandmother-in-law, and she's still around, but I remember when we had because she was born she was 4 when the war ended. She was born during the war, but she would tell me, because I remember I was trying to sort of alternate between bottle feeding and breastfeeding because I had all sorts of problems and I was freaking out. And then she told us how when she remembered her mother, they would mix 2 parts flour with cow's milk and water, and that was what the baby got to drink. And I thought, okay, so formula is actually probably fine then, because if back in the day they mixed cow's milk, flour and water to give a newborn, well, it's all right then. So it sort of put things into perspective a bit. But it is interesting to see how things have changed.
Yes, and the pace of change has really speeded up, I think.
Yeah. But even in terms of women's bodies, I think that was another reason why I wanted to talk about motherhood, because there was so much specific physically in terms of what pregnancy does to your body, things that I had SPD, a pelvic condition, with each pregnancy. But the 2 GPs had never heard of this. I had to tell them about it because I'd Googled it. And I didn't get, they only offered me paracetamol. Literally, someone gave me a set of crutches and then someone else gave me a wheelchair. And it was like, this was 2005.
Pregnancy number 2, I remember I was just so sore. I remember folding clothes, and I could stand up to fold one thing of clothes and I had to sit down again because my back just absolutely gone.
Yeah, but
and was so taken aback by anything that happened I wasn't prepared for any of that.
No, but there was this, at least in my experience, there was this sort of attitude of, oh, well, it's just pregnancy, just get on with it, you know. So yeah, I suppose that that was a shock as well, the way, you know, things were dealt with, and it wasn't just me. I would hear of other women as well with similar complaints, but they were kind of downplayed. So there's so much to talk about, I think, when we talk about motherhood. There's attitudes to women's bodies, and you know, the kind of differing expectations. We think feminism has come on, and try having a child.
I absolutely thought I lived in a post-feminist world up until the age of 34 when I gave birth, and suddenly that wasn't the case. I realized how completely curtailed my particularly career choices had become by that.
Yeah. I wonder, I'm just looking at the time, should we ask the audience to, you know, please feel free to ask any. We're just having a great
having a natter.
We could, I think, you know, all evening. But we got a comment from Lynn. Hi, Lynn. Genevieve, retired midwife here. Sadly, I'm not shocked by these experiences. Attitudes of health professionals take generations to change. Yeah, that's that definitely seems to be the case. I think there's, you know, there's a lot around, and even you mentioned breastfeeding earlier, you know, you're quite right. And I don't think I think the reason why breastfeeding in particular is such a kind of contentious area is not because of what women have said about breastfeeding in particular. It's about the way breastfeeding has kind of been medicalized and portrayed, because I was shocked to learn that breastfeeding is painful.
Yes.
Nobody told me it was going to hurt. Nobody.
I think the impression I got was that if it hurt, you were doing something wrong.
That's right. Yeah.
Which wasn't the case at all.
No.
And I became convinced that the way to do it was to so managed with some difficulty to get it going, but I wanted my husband to give a bottle at night so that I could sleep. I'm not good with little sleep, and I was well aware that you know, I wouldn't be able to every 3 hours to be up and doing something. So that was the plan, and I was made to feel so paranoid about feeding the baby formula that I would be up pumping. I mean, you couldn't hear the TV over the pump. It was so you'd sit there for 40 minutes and end up with this pathetic dribble.
I remember,
you know, and other people did that, and it worked really, really well for them, but it didn't work for me. And I felt kind of dreadful about I was sort of made to feel like I was, and then someone said to me, it's literally formulated to be good for them. I was like, oh yeah, it's not poison.
I remember that too. I literally felt like I was giving them some sort of acid because I had to give up.
You know, and also I think even if you're quite you know, it's easy to get slightly hysterical when you haven't had any sleep and you've got this incredibly important, difficult blue collar job that you've got no clue how to do, and you're up all day and night doing.
Yeah,
it's very easy to doubt, you know.
Yeah, and it's true, and there's nobody there. I don't know. I didn't feel like anyone was there saying, no, you're doing a great job. There's just it's just you doubts. Your sleep deprived doubts.
As Liz Berry says in The Republic of Motherhood, doesn't she? She says, you know, I queued in the bureaucracies of motherhood, and I said, there's literally a red book. You know, it is so the bureaucracies and
the red book. That's right. It was the yellow book when my daughter was born, and then the red book that you had to take to the baby clinic. Oh gosh, it's all coming back in one sort of super dream.
Yeah.
Lynn has said babies are tough. Remember, they get through birth. They're not that fragile. That's true.
That's very true.
I think that's why because I struggled with the formula too. There is some kind of underlying sort of thing that it's less than breast milk and breast is best. You know, and I wanted to breastfeed, but it was awful. But
what I absolutely hate is the culture of guilt around so much of it. Guilt if you work, guilt if you don't work. You know, I ended up with an emergency C-section, and I feel totally fine about that. I didn't have any choice, but I knew other people who had had very much their hearts set on, you know, very natural birth, and that hadn't happened for one reason or another, and they felt on the back foot from the very beginning, that in some way they hadn't given birth properly, there weren't a proper, you know, it breaks my heart that those attitudes are so prevalent, you know, that perhaps breastfeeding didn't work out, or, you know.
No, it's true. I wept over not being able to breastfeed.
I can imagine.
I just felt I had failed in this mission, which is ridiculous now.
With hindsight, you know, and a few good nights sleep behind you.
Exactly.
It's easy to say that, but exactly. I think that's what I liked about these poems, that there were so many different experiences, but also I felt I loved the poems where people were slightly, you know, were admitting things. There's the January Gill O'Neill where she says, my children will say, I interrupted them in the middle of sentences because I could, that I pinched them when they were naughty, you know, that I threw away their artwork when they weren't looking, and sometimes when they were. It's such a brilliant poem, and I just loved it. I needed to hear voices saying, yeah, everyone had toast for tea, and I shouted at my children. You know, I needed those voices as well. So I did want to make sure that was here, as well as it wasn't all, I'm a brilliant, empowering mountain climbing hero of a mother.
Because you know, we're only human, and I think that it is the most important job. You know, it is that kind of what is the word, paradox, that you know, it is so important that you don't want to screw it up, but so it does, I suppose, make you prone to comparisons and to feeling that you're not doing it right, and everyone else seems to be doing it perfectly but you. And so I think literature is really important, and literature that's by women, you know, that's by the women who have gone through this, who have experienced it, and who document this experience, that might be different, but it's still relatable. You can still appreciate, you know.
There were so many sort of phrases that I just was like, oh, that has to go in. There's Denya Stone's poem, Ruby, a 4.5-year-old. And one of the lines was, she's a bit of a laugh that ends up in court. And as the proprietor of a 4-year-old, I just felt that was just chef's kiss perfect. It was, you know, I felt I saw real children, and real women in all of these poems.
All the different vulnerabilities, all the sort of sensitivities, and the fears and the doubts, and it's wonderful to have such a richness of experience in one book. So I can really appreciate, you know, why you've chosen to go with an anthology over any other form, and poetry as well. I think is such a wonderful form as well to capture the layers of experience. It does it so deftly, I think.
I feel that poetry has that ability to just go foot to the floor, straight to the heart of the sort of emotional core. I find it astonishing with some of these poems that I've read sort of 5 lines and I'm in tears, and I sort of feel like if I was reading a novel, you know, you'd have 4 chapters where I got to know the characters before I could be moved to this degree. You know, my heartstrings could be plucked, and I just think that's what poets do, that is so magic, that kind of ability to just, there's no messing around, it's just straight boom into the feeling.
It's like that. I'm at a poem by Glenda Began Vixen. Motherhood peels me bare like a willow wand. Some small child scrapes in the road or throws in the pond. It's that opening line is just a gut punch. Motherhood peels me bare, and then motherhood aches me pale. I bleed with my child's wound. Oh, you know, it is that kind of, they're just so resonant.
There's the line in the Liz Berry Republic of Motherhood that I just think is such a talisman, that poem, where she talks about the unbearable skinless beauty.
Yes.
And you just read that and go, oh, she's so good.
Yeah, she's phenomenal. We've just got a question here. It might be a good way to kind of end, unfortunately, our conversation. Lynn has said, how much and in what ways do you think that social media has changed how women mother, not just the how-tos? Do you see it as damaging or positive? We hear about echo chambers. How is social media influenced or not your writing on motherhood? It's a really good question.
It's a really good question. I think so. Social media was sort of relatively new when I had my first kind of however many years ago, seven years ago. And I found it really connecting and brilliant to be able to sort of put a picture of her on Facebook and say, sure, this looks nice, but she's actually been puking like a garden sprinkler for an hour, you know. And I found it a really comforting way to feel connected to my friends. Instagram wasn't a thing then. And I do wonder whether, you know, the sort of beautifully filtered pictures of people's very tidy kitchens without walls with hand marks all over them. I wonder if I was looking at that, whether that contributes to those feelings of anxiety that I don't know what I'm doing, that I'm not doing this right, that I'm underachieving. Should I be working? I think that comparison culture, which I didn't feel so much with Facebook at the time, which is just a few, you know, your friend group. Right, I think that could be, because I wouldn't have read glossy magazines in which women were, you know, showing off their beautiful homes and their well-behaved babies. So I think that could make things difficult. But I also think it is a space where women do find these communities and are able to confess, you know, some of the things that they feel pointlessly guilty about, and find someone saying, yeah, mine ate pajamas all day yesterday, you know, and find, certainly in the homeschooling hell we've all been in recently, I really found a lot of solidarity through complete strangers on Twitter who, you know, we're sort of going through the same thing and could sort of sympathize and offer solidarity. So I think it's absolutely a double-edged sword. I think it can really increase connectivity and community, and you can find people who feel the same way as you do about parenting, and and then I guess it depends on who you're following and who you're looking at.
I do think there must, I mean, I think it's interesting that we have had this explosion of motherhood literature. I mean, I have seen it in the time that I've been a mother in the 14 years since then. There wasn't Facebook around when I had my first, but it is interesting how we suddenly have this kind of you know, tons of books now on mothers and less controversy.
Yeah, I do wonder whether the fact it's sort of democratized the space a bit, that women could get their stories heard. You know, and a lot of women have been very successful on say something like Instagram, where they can build an enormous platform, and publishers then are really aware that there is an audience for their, you know, they can literally show in metrics that there's an audience for what they're saying. So perhaps it has, that people have just been able to just sort of share in quite a gonzo way their sort of experience has paved the way for that to come into the canon, because there's an obvious readership there.
But interesting still that it wasn't that long ago that they said Holly McNish's book was niche.
Absolutely. Yeah. And she already, you know, was very well known and very established.
Well, it has been absolutely wonderful talking to you this evening. I'm
so pleased we got to meet finally.
Oh, I know. I'm so glad too. It's been just wonderful reading this and enjoying it and having a conversation. So thank you for this book, for bringing it to be, and thank you to our audience for your contributions and your thoughts. And hopefully there will continue to be this wave of new writing and literature on motherhood. So thank you very much, Ana.
Thank you so much for talking to me and for this book, which you know I love so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and have a really, really wonderful evening. Bye.